My biggest pet peeve is lying. I cannot stand it.
Welcome to CelebRush, the home of real celebrity stories that people whisper about but never say out loud. So hit subscribe right now and check out the other deep dives on the channel because this one sets the tone for everything we do here. At 31, Nicola Peltz is finally speaking from her own point of view about what really went down with the David Beckham family. And no, this is not some cheap rumor or headline bait. This is about pressure, power, and what happens when love walks into a spotlight that never turns off. I never planned to say this out loud, but some secrets sit so heavy they can crack a marriage long before they touch a public image. And people keep asking me, why did you break up the Beckham family? While no one ever asks the real question, what was happening behind closed doors? Do you know how it feels to step into a family where every smile feels rehearsed, every hug feels timed, and every move you make is judged like a slip waiting to be replayed? Because that was my reality. And I loved Brooklyn with a full heart, truly believing love could outmuscle fame, power, and all those unspoken rules. But I was wrong. When love collides with fame, support is loud until you stop moving the way others expect, and that is when the energy shifts fast. So in the next few minutes, I am breaking down the exact moments that made me see things clearly. No sugarcoating, no hype, just the truth as it unfolded. Sometimes the real danger is not an outsider or a scandal. It is the quiet tension inside a family that looks flawless on the surface. And if you want answers, the only move is to face it head on and go straight into the truth. So stay locked in and keep watching. I remember it crystal clear, July 2019. The kind of memory that sticks whether you want it to or not. London, the very first night I officially stepped inside David and Victoria Beckham's home as Brooklyn's girlfriend. No cameras flashing, no press leaks, just a private family dinner that somehow felt bigger than any red carpet moment. Before we walked in, Brooklyn leaned close and said, "Just be yourself." But his voice gave him away because it sounded more like hope than confidence. And that was when it hit me. He wanted it to go smoothly more than he believed it would. David was the first to rise from his seat, hand out, that familiar smile locked in, the one the world has trusted for decades, asking where I flew in from, if the trip wore me out, how work had been going, speaking calmly, smoothly, like someone who has already climbed every mountain and no longer needs to announce it. There was a quiet authority to him, not loud, not flashy, just the kind of control that comes from living under bright lights for so long that you never need to demand attention. It already follows you. Victoria was a different energy altogether, sitting straight back across from me, eyes sharp, watching more than reacting, measuring more than engaging. And when Brooklyn introduced me as Nicola, she nodded slowly, offered a restrained smile, and said, "We have heard a lot about you." I did not ask what a lot meant, because something in my gut told me curiosity would not be rewarded in that moment. So I stayed quiet and played it cool. Dinner rolled on with stories that sounded harmless on the surface. David talking football and his packed schedule. Victoria speaking about fashion, discipline, and the pressure of holding together a flawless public image. And that was when I realized this table was not just about food, it was about expectations. I listened closely, and when they asked, I spoke about acting, about how I hated being boxed in as a rich girl, about wanting to be seen as someone who carved her own lane instead of being handed one. And the second I said that, Victoria held my stare just a moment longer than normal. No pushback, no praise, just a look that said more than words ever could. One moment still plays in my head clearly, when Victoria turned to Brooklyn and asked, "How long do you plan to stay in the US?" And before answering, Brooklyn glanced at me. Just a split second, but it was enough to flip the mood in the room completely. That was when it clicked for me. Even without anyone saying it out loud, his choices were no longer just ours. They belonged to the room, the family, the system. After dinner, while David poured another glass of wine, he looked at me calmly and asked, "Are you used to being watched?" And I answered honestly, saying, "I grew up in a well-known family too, but every house still has its own rules, its own reality." David nodded like he understood, but Victoria stayed silent, gently placing her glass down on the table, and that quiet clink somehow echoed louder than any comment she could have made that night. Later in our room, when Brooklyn apologized, I asked him straight up, "For what?" And he said nothing, no explanation, no defense, just silence. And that silence ran cold through me. That was when I began to understand how this family works. Nothing is spelled out, nothing is explained, but somehow you are still expected to know the rules. The visits after that were never dramatic or explosive, but the pressure sharpened every single time. And as Brooklyn and I talked about our future, where to live and what direction to take, it became clear those choices were never going to be simple. There was always one name hanging in the air, even when nobody dared to say it out loud: the Beckham family. And over time I started to see the structure clearly. David keeping the balance steady, Victoria enforcing the order, and that order existed long before I ever showed up. By the end of 2019, during another quiet gathering, Victoria looked straight at me and asked, "Do you think you are ready for this life? Not marriage, not being a wife, but this life." And I knew instantly what she meant. I answered simply. I said I loved Brooklyn, and she smiled. But this time it never touched her eyes, and that small detail stayed with me longer than the question itself. On the way home, Brooklyn tried to smooth it over, saying, "My mom's just looking out for me." And I didn't argue, but inside my head a question formed, one I never said out loud. If a mother loves her son so deeply that there is no space left, then where does that leave the woman who comes after? Because that space matters more than people like to admit. I still love Brooklyn, and I still believe in what we have. But from that moment on, I understood the truth. The wedding ahead was not just about two young people in love. It was an event, a symbol, and maybe even a quiet test of control. And I, Nicola Peltz, was not just getting ready to be a bride. I was stepping into a family where love comes with rules, expectations, and consequences, where every wrong step carries a price. I don't know exactly where the tragedy begins, but I know this much for sure. From that very first evening, I was no longer an outsider, and somehow never fully on the inside either. April 2022. Palm Beach, Florida, just 3 days before the wedding, and I was standing alone in the fitting room with bright lights pouring straight down from the ceiling, the Valentino dress hanging in front of me like a final decision already made. Brooklyn sat on the sofa, eyes locked on his phone, quiet, distracted, and when the door opened, I felt it instantly. This was not a casual drop-in. This moment carried weight. Victoria walked in with her assistant, calm steps, no visible tension. But her eyes spoke loud and clear, scanning the room, then the dress, then landing on me. And she said, "Nicola, are you sure about this choice?" Her voice so smooth it almost made me question whether I needed to defend myself or explain. I answered without hesitation. I said I had already made my choice, and the energy in that room shifted immediately, sharp and undeniable. Brooklyn finally looked up, eyes moving from his mom to me, while Victoria paused for a few seconds, then continued softly, saying the day was very important, that there are traditions, and I heard the part she did not say, "Not my traditions." I responded clearly, saying this was Brooklyn's and my wedding day, and Brooklyn jumped in, his voice rushed, saying, "Mom, we already agreed on this," trying to shut it down fast. Victoria turned to him and said, "I'm speaking with Nicola." No raised voice, no drama, but the message landed hard. And right there, I understood the roles were being redrawn in real time. That evening, during the family dinner, David sat at the head of the table, quiet, composed, not stepping into the argument, but watching everything closely. And sometimes, silence says more than taking sides ever could. When the wedding schedule came up, I said I wanted the first dance to stay private, just Brooklyn and me. No crowd, no moment hijacked, and David nodded like he understood right away. Victoria slowly placed her knife and fork down and said, "Family is always at the heart of moments like this. Calm tone, soft delivery, but the message underneath was loud." This time I didn't retreat. I said I agreed, but the family I was building was with Brooklyn, and the room froze instantly. Nobody spoke after that. Brooklyn dropped his eyes. David took a slow sip of wine, and I felt it in my chest. I had crossed a line, and it was the day of the wedding rehearsal. The tension was no longer hidden, it was right there in the open, and when the band started rehearsing, confusion broke out about the order of the dances, and the host asked for clarification. Victoria walked straight onto the stage and spoke quietly to the band while I stood below waiting. Brooklyn next to me, his hand gripping mine tight like he already knew where this was headed. I stepped forward and said clearly, "This part is for Brooklyn and me. And Victoria turned, looked directly at me and said in front of everyone, "We are just trying to make everything perfect." Smooth voice, sharp moment, I answered back. "Perfect for who?" And the room went dead silent. No claps, no smiles, no fake laughs to soften it. That was when David finally spoke, voice low and steady, saying, "All right, let's stick to your plan." And just like that, the moment ended. Victoria didn't argue, but the cold in her eyes that night was impossible to miss. And later, Brooklyn and I had our first argument since getting engaged. And no, it wasn't about the dress. It was about pressure, loyalty, and lines that had already been crossed. It was never really about the dance. It was about the moment he didn't step in for me when it mattered, and Brooklyn admitted he felt caught in the middle. But I told him straight, I didn't want to become his battlefield, and when he went quiet after that, that silence hit harder than any argument ever could. The wedding day arrived under the Florida sun, picture perfect on the outside. Hundreds of guests filling the space, celebrities, athletes, friends, family, cameras everywhere, flashing non-stop, capturing every angle whether you wanted it or not. As I walked down the aisle, I heard whispers, caught side glances, people studying the dress, watching both families, scanning the room to see who really held control of the space. And even while I smiled, I felt myself being pulled away from the center by tiny details, seating placements, speaking order, moments quietly shortened. Brooklyn held my hand tighter than usual, like he sensed the tension without fully naming it. David stayed in his role as the calm mediator, and Victoria kept her distance, not far enough to disappear, but far enough to make the boundary crystal clear. After the reception, when the crowd thinned and the noise faded, I found myself alone in the dressing room, the quiet finally settling in, and when Brooklyn walked in, hugged me and said, "I'm sorry," I looked at him and asked, "What are you sorry for?" He didn't have an answer, and in that moment, it hit me hard. This wedding didn't fix anything. It just exposed tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface the entire time. I didn't walk out of that ceremony feeling like I had just begun a marriage. I walked out feeling like I had officially stepped into a long tug of war, where love was no longer simple, and nothing was ever going to be just between the two of us again. Family and power never sit on the same side for long, and that was when I understood the cracks were already there. Small, quiet, easy to ignore, but deep enough that if nobody faced them head-on, they would eventually rip everything apart. After the wedding, we left Florida and went back to Los Angeles, carrying something heavy with us, not the glow of newlyweds, but the exhaustion of two people who had just survived a test where no one really won. Those early days felt strange. Brooklyn tried hard to bring back normal life, cooking dinner, playing music, talking about the future, acting like a new city could reset everything. But I quickly saw the truth. Even married, the Beckham family still hovered over every small decision we made. Brooklyn's phone never stayed quiet for long. Calls from London, messages answered instantly, conversations I couldn't fully hear but could feel pressing in on us. And some nights, right in the middle of dinner, he would step onto the balcony to take a call. When he came back inside, his face was tight, his energy drained. And when I asked what was wrong, he always said it was nothing important. But if it really wasn't important, why did it weigh on him so heavily? Our first disagreements didn't turn into shouting matches. They started quietly, with simple questions, asking if we could control our own schedule, choose where we lived, build a life that actually belonged to us. Brooklyn would tell me his family was just concerned about him, and every time he said that, I felt the same thought creep in. Concern can sound a lot like control when it never lets go. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for months. At what point does concern turn into control? And Brooklyn didn't answer, and that told me everything I needed to know, because for him, that line had been blurred a long time ago. When I started taking on my own projects, the tension shifted fast. Nobody outright said I couldn't work. Nobody openly pushed back, but the discomfort showed up in side comments and carefully worded conversations. Someone would mention that Brooklyn needed more stability. Someone else would remind us how important the family image was. And slowly I realized I had been cast into a role I never agreed to play. The wife who was not supposed to disturb an order that had been in place for decades. Our first real fight came toward the end of 2022, and it wasn't about money or careers. It was about a trip to London. Brooklyn wanted to go alone, and when I asked why I couldn't come with him, he said it was a family matter. I asked him, Then what am I? And the silence that followed stretched on forever. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that when things truly mattered, I was still viewed as an outsider. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was asking for too much, if I misunderstood his family's way of doing things. And every time I tried to shrink myself to keep the peace, I felt myself fading just a little more. I stopped saying everything I felt, chose silence over honesty, and during video calls with his family, I began editing my words, my expressions, even my tone, just to avoid friction. That was when I realized I was in a marriage where peace only existed if one person kept getting smaller. And Brooklyn was trapped in the middle, exhausted, torn apart, telling me some nights that he just wanted everyone to get along. I looked at him and thought the question I never said out loud: how are we supposed to get along if the cost is always me? I never needed him to cut off his family. That was never the ask. All I needed was for him to stand beside me when it actually mattered. But every single time I needed him, he was pulled somewhere else, not by direct orders, but by an invisible force that only powerful families seem to have. That's when doubts started creeping in, not about physical loyalty, but emotional loyalty. And I began asking myself hard questions, like when Brooklyn stayed quiet around his family, when he said things like, "Let's talk later," "Take it slow," "Don't make it a big deal." Was he protecting peace, or was he choosing silence over me? I felt myself slipping down the priority list, and that feeling can kill a marriage faster than any headline or rumor ever could. The media pressure poured gasoline on everything, every article, every comment section turning into fresh tension. Brooklyn told me not to read any of it, but when your name is being dissected daily, that's not something you can just ignore. He said it was the price of fame, and I told him I didn't marry him to become someone else's price. And that's when our arguments changed, not louder, not uglier, but heavier, because we both knew something important was slowly being lost. When talks of children started coming up, everything shifted again, because that's when things stop being theoretical and start becoming real. I asked him how we would raise our kids, where we would live, what values we would stand on, and he kept saying we would figure it out later. But to me, that wasn't a future problem. It was a power question. I was scared that if we brought kids into this situation, I wouldn't just be fighting for my place anymore, I'd be fighting for theirs too. And that fear sat with me every single day, growing louder the longer it went unanswered. That fear kept me awake more nights than I want to admit, and during one video call with his family, someone joked, "The Beckham kid has to grow up the right way." Everyone laughed like it was harmless, but I didn't even smile. I looked straight at Brooklyn, and in that moment he avoided my eyes, and I knew right then I was standing at a crossroads. Stay quiet and slowly erase myself, or face the truth that our love was being crushed under expectations that were never mine. No one ever said the hard parts out loud, and our marriage didn't collapse in one big moment. It cracked slowly, call by call, silence by silence. And every time Brooklyn chose keeping the peace over standing with me, another piece chipped away. I don't hate him, not even close, because I can see he's trapped too, pulled from both sides. But I started to realize something painful. In this situation, there wasn't room for both of us to win. When a marriage makes you choose between love and your own existence, it stops being a marriage, and that thought shook me to my core. I started asking myself questions that wouldn't let go. If I stayed, who would I be in 5 years? In 10 years? A perfect wife for the public? Polished and smiling, but empty inside. A name only mentioned as Brooklyn Beckham's wife, no longer Nicola Peltz. That question followed me everywhere, louder than any argument, heavier than any silence, and I knew deep down that sooner or later, I would have to do the one thing no one in his family wanted. I would stop staying silent, and that's when the decisions I had been avoiding started forming quietly. No big announcement, no dramatic exit, just a clear understanding that the real storm in this marriage hadn't even started yet. Early 2023 Los Angeles, we had been married almost a year, and from the outside, everything still looked fine. The carefully chosen photos, the perfectly timed smiles. But behind closed doors, our marriage had shifted into something colder. Every choice now felt like a political move, every step weighed by family impact, image, and control. And that's when I knew we were no longer just fighting for love. We were fighting a system that never planned to make room for me in the first place. Brooklyn started quietly pulling back from some of his family events. No announcements, no drama, just busy schedules, missed flights, and vague excuses. And I knew those choices weren't coming from indifference, they came straight from exhaustion. Every time his phone buzzed more than usual, long calls, messages read and deleted, tension written all over his face. I asked what was going on, and every time he brushed it off, saying it was just a misunderstanding, but it never felt that simple. March 2023, London. We flew back for a family occasion, and the second we stepped into that familiar house, I felt it. The shift was immediate. Nobody raised their voice, nobody showed anger, but the air was thick, heavy, like everyone was waiting for the right second to finally say what had been bottled up for too long. Victoria greeted me politely, just as controlled as always. David shook Brooklyn's hand, but his eyes carried more weight than usual. And that dinner didn't drag on. The conversations stayed tight, circling work schedules, public image, obligations, everything except the real issue. When I mentioned that Brooklyn and I wanted to plan our own time, Victoria looked straight at me and said it plainly this time. No soft tone, no filters. When my son shows up, he doesn't just represent himself, and the room instantly locked up. I answered just as directly, saying when her son got married, he stopped belonging only to his old family, and the silence that followed was absolute, sharp enough to feel in your chest. David stepped in, voice low, trying to cool things down, saying we were talking about sensitive matters, but by then it didn't matter. The sensitive things had finally been said out loud. After dinner, nothing needed to be explained anymore. The lines were clear. The positions were set, and I knew we had crossed a point where pretending was no longer possible, because once the truth is spoken, there's no way to push it back into silence. Brooklyn went off to speak with his parents in private, and I stayed outside, close enough to hear voices through a half-closed door. No yelling, no chaos, just short, firm words that carried real weight. When he finally stepped out, his face had lost its color, and he looked at me and said, "I can't please everyone." And I answered him immediately, saying, I didn't need him to please anyone. I needed him to choose. He stared at me for a long time, searching for something to say, and then he said nothing at all, and that silence was the most painful answer I had heard yet. By summer 2023, the distance stopped being private and started showing in public, Brooklyn missing major family events, his absence becoming noticeable, and the press jumping in fast with words like rift and estranged, while unnamed sources suddenly had plenty to say. Brooklyn and I argued more often, not because of the headlines, but because those headlines were finally reflecting the truth we had been avoiding. One night in Los Angeles, everything spilled over. We argued until we were both emotionally drained, and I told him I couldn't keep living like I had, to constantly prove I wasn't a threat to his family. Brooklyn said he couldn't turn his back on his parents, and I asked him the question that had been sitting between us for months. What about me? And he said he was trying, but by that point, trying without choosing wasn't enough anymore. By the end of 2023, at a public event, Brooklyn showed up without his family. Cameras caught the absence instantly, and the next day, the headlines exploded everywhere. I read every word, and for the first time, I wasn't scared. I was just tired, because what they called rumors were really the result of a quiet war that had been going on for far too long. Victoria didn't call me, David didn't either, and this silence felt different, colder, final in a way I hadn't felt before. Brooklyn got a long call from London, and when he hung up, he sat beside me and said, "They think you're pulling me away from the family." And I looked straight at him and asked, "What do you think?" He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation, that pause, hurt more than any accusation ever could, because by then, I already knew what it meant. Our arguments stopped circling around hints and avoidance. They became direct, raw, and painful, and every single one of them came back to the same question. Is our love strong enough to survive when it's forced to stand against a powerful family? Brooklyn told me he loved me, and I believed him, but I could also see the damage it was doing to him, being pulled in two directions, and every time he tried to hold both sides together, he lost another piece of himself. The moment I knew we were at the edge came when Brooklyn, completely drained, said, "I just want everyone to stop." And when I asked him to stop what, he said, "So I can breathe." And that's when it hit me. In this marriage, we were both suffocating. The difference was simple and brutal. I had nowhere left to step back, no space left to shrink into, while the pressure kept closing in. In the days that followed, we lived side by side, but felt farther apart than we ever had. each of us carrying a different fear. Mine was losing myself inside a structure that was never built to hold me. Brooklyn's fear was losing his family, and caught between those two fears, our marriage was being crushed slowly, openly, piece by piece. By the end of 2023, I knew this fight was no longer private. It had turned into a public story whether we wanted it or not. And in public stories, someone always gets labeled the problem, and this time, that someone was me. But the hardest part wasn't the public attention. The hardest part was realizing the man I loved no longer had the strength to stand in the middle, and without that, love alone was no longer enough to keep us standing. And when he could no longer stand in the middle, it became clear that someone would eventually have to step away. And even though I didn't leave right then, I knew with absolute certainty we were standing at the edge, and if the fall came, it was not going to be gentle. February 2024, Los Angeles. It started with a short phone call from David. No warm-up, no apologies, just straight to the point. We need to talk, all of us. And I looked at Brooklyn as he nodded slowly, like he had been expecting this moment for a long time. The meeting happened in a quiet house in Beverly Hills. No press, no assistants, no distractions, just the four of us: David, Victoria, Brooklyn, and me. And the energy felt different from the start. Not explosive, not dramatic, just heavy with exhaustion. It was the kind of tension that comes when people know they've gone too far to pretend things can go back to how they were. David sat across from us with his hands clasped, Victoria beside him, posture perfect, eyes locked on me, and Brooklyn sat in the middle like always, but this time, he didn't look down. David spoke first, talking about family, about years spent building their image, about choices made to protect their children, and I listened carefully until he finished. When he stopped, I spoke slowly and clearly, saying I understood what protection meant, but protecting someone should never mean taking away another person's right to exist. Victoria frowned instantly and replied that no one had taken anything from me, and I met her gaze and asked the question that had been burning inside me for years. If nothing had been taken, then why did I always have to ask for permission when it came to decisions about my own husband? The room tightened in an instant, and for the first time, Brooklyn took a deep breath and interrupted his mother, saying, "Mom, I'm 26 years old." Victoria turned to him without hesitation and said, "I know, but you're still my son." And in that moment, I understood everything. That sentence explained the past, the pressure, the silence, and the impossible position Brooklyn had been trapped in. And I knew right then that this conversation wasn't about compromise anymore. It was about control, identity, and lines that had never truly been redrawn. Brooklyn answered, his voice shaking but steady enough to hold its ground, and he said, "And I'm Nicola's husband." And that sentence dropped heavy in the room, like everyone felt it at the same time. I watched his hand clench, and I knew exactly how much that line had cost him, because that wasn't rebellion. That was him finally choosing to speak. The conversation dragged on for hours. No yelling, no explosions, just words aimed straight at the soft spots. And I laid it all out. The dinners where I wasn't consulted, the trips I wasn't told about, the constant feeling of being treated like a disruption instead of a person. Victoria pushed back, saying she only wanted to keep the family close, and I asked her plainly, "Close how? If anyone who comes in has to make themselves smaller just to fit." David stepped in, trying to pull things back to neutral, saying, "We all love Brooklyn," and I nodded because I didn't doubt that for a second. But I said every kind of love needs boundaries, or it turns into something else. There was a moment when Victoria went completely quiet. No composure, no controlled smile, just silence. And then she said, stripped bare of polish, "You don't understand what this family had to give up to get here." I answered without raising my voice, saying I didn't come to tear down what they built. I came to build my part of it, and those words hung in the air, solid, undeniable. That was when Brooklyn stood up, really stood up for the first time, and he didn't apologize to anyone. He just said he loved both sides, but he couldn't keep living like his marriage was a project waiting for approval. David looked at his son for a long moment. No anger, no lecture, just a heavy pause. And then he said calmly, "You know there will be consequences." And in that moment, I understood the cost of choosing yourself in a family built on control. Brooklyn nodded and said, "I know." And after that meeting, there were no hugs, no reassurances, no promises to fix anything, just the truth sitting out in the open with nowhere left to hide. Brooklyn and I left together in silence, the car ride heavy, and he finally said he didn't know where all of this was headed, and I told him I just needed to know where he stood, and even though he held my hand tighter than ever, I could still feel the fear in that grip. The weeks that followed were brutal. His family reached out less, the media kept circling, speculation growing louder, and Brooklyn grew quieter by the day, and I knew he was paying a real price for choosing to speak up. That made me feel two things at once, grateful that he was standing with me, and guilty knowing what it was costing him. We started talking about the future differently, less fantasy, more reality, and I told him clearly that I couldn't keep living like I was waiting for approval to exist in my own marriage. He told me just as honestly that he couldn't fully turn his back on his family, and those two truths hit each other head-on, solid, unmovable. April 2024, there was a major family gathering in London, and this time Brooklyn didn't go. No excuse, no scheduling conflict, he just said, "I'm not ready," and I didn't celebrate that choice. There was no sense of winning, no feeling of victory, only the clear realization that every step forward came with something else being left behind. One night, we sat on the living room floor with no lights on, just the glow from the street outside, and Brooklyn admitted he was scared of disappointing me, and I told him I was scared of losing him, and we both laughed, tired, worn down, but honest. That was when it hit me. There were no villains in this marriage, just people who loved in different ways, inside a family structure too big and too rigid to bend easily. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it shifted something important. We stopped pretending. I stopped staying silent to keep the peace. Brooklyn stopped apologizing without knowing why, and whether they liked it or not, his family had finally heard us speak. By the time May arrived, I knew one door had closed for good and another had opened. Not a door leading to some perfect reunion, but one leading straight into hard, uncomfortable decisions. I understood clearly that from that point on, every choice would come with a cost, and the question was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about what we were willing to pay to keep moving forward. The conversation in Beverly Hills didn't fix everything, but it did end the longest and most dangerous thing we had all been living with: silence. And once silence breaks, everything left behind is forced into the light, whether you're ready for it or not, no matter how painful that truth might be. After everything we went through, the strangest realization hit me. I didn't want to win anymore. I didn't want to prove a point. I didn't want to explain myself again and again. I just wanted to breathe. And I knew Brooklyn wanted the same thing. When you spend enough days being watched, questioned, analyzed, and labeled, you start to see clearly that some battles might look like victories on the outside, but quietly destroy what matters most at home. So we chose silence, not because we were scared, but because we wanted to protect the parts of ourselves that hadn't been broken yet. And let me be honest, after all the storms, my life with Brooklyn is not a fairy tale. There's no dramatic soundtrack, no perfect lighting, no polished moments. There are just real mornings where I wake up and hear him moving around the kitchen, searching for coffee, ordinary sounds that remind me that sometimes peace doesn't look impressive, it just feels necessary. Then he turns to me, casual, almost quiet, and asks, "Are you okay today?" Nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed, just that. And to me, that simple question is what we were missing all along. Real care that doesn't need to be proven. We spend most of our time in Los Angeles now, and it's easier to breathe here. Not because we're hiding from anyone, but because we're not trapped in a family schedule that runs like a machine and never slows down. Here, I can throw on a t-shirt, tie my hair up, and walk out the door without mentally preparing myself to be watched, judged, or measured. And here, Brooklyn doesn't move like he's inside some museum called Beckham. Here, he's just my husband, and I'm just his wife. No roles, no performance, no invisible scoreboard keeping track of who's doing what right. Brooklyn works in his own lane now. Food projects, cooking, experimenting, learning, doing things that make him feel useful and fulfilled without waiting for anyone's approval. And I understand that feeling better than most. There was a time when he tried way too hard to prove he was worthy, and that kind of pressure slowly drains a person. I saw it in his eyes, the weight of being pushed to become the version others expect instead of who you really are. I don't want Brooklyn living like that, chasing expectations that don't belong to him. I want him living as himself, fully, freely, without permission. As for me, I still work, but I'm selective now. I don't chase attention, I don't chase visibility, and I don't feel the urge to explain myself anymore. Every time my name trends online, some days I read the comments and just laugh because people talk about me like they live in my house, like they sat with me through those silent dinners. One day I'm painted as the villain, the next day I'm framed as the victim, and the truth is, neither version knows what it actually took just to get here and breathe again. I look at all of it now and realize that if I keep living in reaction to other people's opinions, then I'm no longer living for Brooklyn or for myself. And the truth is, the hardest part was never the public noise. It was always the family. I never cut off Brooklyn's family, and I never wanted to take him away from anyone. That was never the goal, but I understood something important. If I kept trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law by someone else's rules, I would slowly disappear. And at one point, I almost did. And that scared me more than any headline ever could. Now, my relationship with his family isn't the warm, photo-ready version people expect to see. It's something else, a respectful distance, maintained so no one gets hurt even more. There were times I wanted to send long messages explaining myself, saying I'm not the enemy, saying I never came to destroy anything, but I stopped because in families built on pride and spotlight, explanations don't always build bridges. Sometimes explanations turn into sparks, and sparks can burn everything down. So I chose a different path. I stay respectful. I don't speak badly. I don't throw shade. I don't use the media as a weapon. I just hold my boundaries, and that's the part people struggle with the most. Because boundaries are what make people the angriest. They're the moment you're no longer under anyone's control. When it comes to Brooklyn's siblings, I want to be fair. People love the clean narrative that the whole family hates me. But real life isn't that simple. Brooklyn still loves his brothers, and they still love him. Romeo and Cruz have had moments of closeness and moments of distance, but family is still family. The real issue is that when your family is a public symbol, every relationship becomes part of the image, every interaction gets examined, and nothing is ever allowed to just be private or human anymore. You're no longer allowed to love in your own way. You're expected to love in a way that looks good to the public. Polished, approved, and easy to consume. And I hate that. I hate that even family affection has to feel like a performance. There was one moment that stays with me. I watched Brooklyn sit silently after a call with his family. No tears, no anger, just stillness. And I realized his pain didn't come from feeling unloved. His pain came from always being forced to choose between his wife and his family, when all he ever wanted was for both to exist without conflict. I told him something once, and I meant it more than anything I've ever said. I'm not asking you to walk away from anyone. I just don't want you to walk away from yourself. That's the real promise I hold on to. And when it comes to Harper, the youngest, I stay as gentle as I possibly can, because I don't want any child growing up feeling like they have to pick a side. I never want Harper to sit with that question in her head, wondering who's right and who's wrong, because kids don't need verdicts, they need peace. And after everything we've been through, all the pressure, the silence, the public noise, the hardest truth might surprise people. I love Brooklyn more now than I did when we first got married. Not because things are perfect, but because love that survives this kind of weight becomes deeper, quieter, and far more real than anything that ever looked good on camera. Newlywed love always comes with bright lights and that rush in your chest. But love after the storm is different. It's quieter, heavier, and it's a choice you make over and over again, even on the days that don't feel easy at all. I love Brooklyn not because of the Beckhams, not because of a name or a legacy, but because when I'm with him, I see a real man, sometimes vulnerable, sometimes unsure, sometimes scared, but always trying, always showing up, always protecting the small family we've built together. And Brooklyn loves me in a way that makes pretending impossible, because he doesn't love an image or a role. He loves me as a person, sometimes strong, sometimes exhausted, sometimes overly sensitive, and he never needs me to be perfect or adorable to deserve that love. He doesn't ask me to perform. He doesn't ask me to smile through discomfort. He just looks at me and asks, "Are you okay?" And that question means more to me than any grand gesture ever could. People ask me all the time, after everything, "Are you actually happy?" And I answer it honestly. We're not happy in a fairy tale way, not the glossy kind people expect. We're happy in the way that means we finally get to live, breathe, and exist without asking permission. We have our own home, our own rhythm, our own meals, our own small getaways just to clear our heads, and quiet evenings where we don't have to talk and we're not afraid of the silence. We still remember, we still ache sometimes, and guilt hasn't disappeared completely. But we no longer let those feelings tear us apart because surviving the storm taught us what actually matters. I don't need the world to agree with me or declare me right. I just need Brooklyn to turn to me, take my hand and say, let's go home. Because now home isn't a last name, it isn't a brand, and it isn't a standard. It's us. Home is not a place. It's a man who chose to stay, and I chose to stay too. Not to fight anyone, not to win, but to protect the love that almost got lost along the way. I paid a real price for that choice, and if you ask me what I've learned from all of this, it's not how to survive public opinion, and it's definitely not how to live next to a famous family. What I truly learned is how to choose myself without becoming selfish, how to stand firm without turning cold, and how to love without erasing who I am. I used to believe love meant enduring everything, staying quiet, softening myself, shrinking just enough so no one felt uncomfortable, thinking that if I lasted long enough, everything would eventually be okay. But the truth is this: you can sacrifice to save a relationship, but you cannot disappear to keep it alive. Because when you lose your voice and your boundaries, love turns into a closed room, and you're the first one who runs out of air. I'm not telling this story to point fingers or place blame. I'm sharing it because so many people are living this exact reality, caught between family, marriage, expectations, and the constant pressure to be the good one for everyone, not trying so hard to keep the peace that you forget who you are in the process. I don't want anyone watching this to choose war, but I do hope you choose truth with yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. My marriage isn't perfect, my family situation isn't perfect, but everything changed the moment Brooklyn and I looked at each other and agreed on one thing: we will not live to please the world. We'll live in a way that doesn't betray each other and doesn't betray ourselves. If you've made it this far, I know this story hit something personal. Maybe there's a question sitting deep inside you that you've been afraid to say out loud. Say it at least to yourself, because staying silent for too long doesn't make you strong or noble, it just makes you exhausted. Before you go, I want you to answer this in the comments. Honestly, in your own family or relationship, have you ever had to choose between being loved and being yourself? And if you want more real, unfiltered celebrity stories like this, make sure you subscribe to CelebRush right now and check out the other videos on the channel, because the stories people don't want told are exactly what we uncover next.